Okay. I've got a little Shih Tzu with me, so if you can hear snuffling and sort of grunting in the background, that'll be him. I think everyone already knows the deal. Some of you are in VC, in the Discord. Some of you will be watching via the stream, which is fine. But the deal is, we go through some critique, and I give my thoughts, and generally people stay quiet in VC unless it's their work that's being critiqued. So let's see, who's up first? We have... Nope. This. Which is quite a big image, isn't it? Let's see. What's the question? The question is, I would like generic feedback on how to make the grassland seem less flat in a way, and perhaps how to make it seem more interesting and varied. Some guidance on the composition of the whole image would be cool as well, if there's time. Okay. Well, there is time. Hello, Jam, in chat. Your grass isn't 3D at the moment. Your grass is like a flat, textured plane. So, let's get our color window. It's a new PC, you see, so I've had to reset up those stuff. So, you're imagining currently that your grass is some kind of flat plane. And what I think you have to imagine is that on top of that plane sits another plane. So that's the top surface of your grass. But actually inside of all that we can see in, and there's all this texture. Right? So places where we would see a side plane on grass is basically where the grass isn't. So if your fence is coming up, or your path is going through the center here, well then we're going to get a side plane of grass here, right? On the other side of that path you might get a side plane of grass that is lighter. You're going to get grass that comes in front of objects that are sitting on it, like a horse. That includes shadows. The shadows are cast onto grass, so the shadows themselves are going to have some kind of grass texture. Right, so I think a lot of your lighting work that you're putting down is not reflective of the fact that it's on a 3D surface. Is effectively what the main issue is. The other benefit of this grass idea is that it's a really nice indicator of perspective, right? So if we have our image, that's our horizon over there. You might get some nice big grass tufts closer to us as a viewer, and those grass clumps are going to get smaller and closer together the further away they are, to the point where it'll just be like individual lines, you know. Right? So you can reinforce the perspective. Let me find an image where I do exactly this, because I think I've got a reasonably decent example. I've got to sort out my Discord settings or something because it keeps turning Spotify off. Let's just turn the sensitivity up a bit more. So let me find an example of exactly this. 2023 maybe. 2024. 2024. So here's some grass. Okay. It is nice and big, and we're seeing separations between individual blades in the foreground, and then in the distance it's like an individual line, right? And that's all there is to show that there's a divot in that grass, and a lot of the texture flattens out, so more texture in the foreground, less texture in the background. We're getting that perspective going back. We could see if we could do something like that here. So effectively we're saying, look, there's all this stuff, right? But if that same stuff were happening back here, you know, it might be considerably thinner, and obviously back here there might not be any stuff at all. I know you're probably aiming to simplify the grass in a way that isn't drawing each individual blade. But I think this kind of texture work works reasonably nicely. I'd say generally your shadows seem a little dark, considering how bright the sky is. So I might also be tempted to just lighten them up a bit. So you're also going to have atmospheric perspective, which is going to mean the shadows on these mountains back here might be, let's just set it on lighten, and then grab the sky color. Might be miles lighter, but that might affect that grass as well in an interesting way. So keep that flat, keep the texture in the foreground, and make sure that that texture is affecting shadows and things. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? I hope so. How's everyone else doing? Does anyone know if there's a way to turn off the Discord setting that turns off Spotify when you're talking? Because that's really annoying. Do I just disconnect Spotify from Discord? Maybe. That does help. Okay. Compositionally, I think there's a lot to talk about. I'm just going to sit here without music. Put your own music on, because mine's going to keep turning off. Compositionally, there's a few things going on. There are tangents. We don't like tangents necessarily, so that's a reasonably egregious tangent. That's a reasonably egregious tangent. The fact that this lines up with what I can only assume is the other side of the path is kind of a tangent. You know, the belly of the horse lining up with the horizon, you might consider another one. And so a tangent is I think it's a miscommunication of depth, right? If I draw a tree, oh, look at this. I'm a great artist. There's my tree. And then I draw here's a car. Okay. If the two are separate like that, then we don't have a problem at all, right? If the two are overlapping completely, then I know that my car is either going in front of the tree, like that, or I know that my car is going behind the tree. Again, not really a problem. The problem is when my car is doing something like that, where they're like just kissing each other, right? I don't know if the car's behind. I don't know if it's in front. It's a sort of a point of visual tension. It feels unnatural that these two things share an edge when they feel like they should be separate objects. And so I would probably err on the side of things overlapping each other, right? But just give them enough distance. So we could say fence post ends there. We could say, where's our path? Could the path maybe go in a more of an S curvy shape, so it comes this side and then it actually overlaps all the way over here and then overlaps again in some way or another, right? So that it's popping out on both sides. It's not disappearing like a magic trick or something. Yeah, maybe some of these are coming above the horizon line. That kind of implies that the fence is higher up than the camera, but that's fine. Maybe it is. And pretty quick you can solve those tangents, and they're not hitting us quite as hard in a frustrating way. Right? So I think the other thing that you've got is almost like three completely separate elements in the image. So you've got horse and Pikmin, you've got mountains, and you've got fence, and none of these three are interacting in any meaningful way, which is a little bit frustrating, right? So if you were to recompose said image, you might still have fence, right? And then we got our path, and then the horse is sat on the path having a nice meal. Nom 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 nom. We've got horizon line that's crossing through horse, but then the mountain range is like behind the horse or something, so it's framing it, right? And that way they're interacting maybe in more of an extreme way. You could even have, let's think about another one. You could have horse foreground. I know that doesn't look like a horse, but it is, trust me. Horse foreground. Fence behind horse. Right, so you've got that overlap. And then you could still have some kind of path that goes back, and then our mountain, right? But they're stacked on top of each other, all three elements, rather than being sort of sitting side by side. They're foreground to background, they're stacked. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Yes? No? Maybe? Yes, sir. Very good. Right. Just other things to watch out for. It kind of goes hand in hand with this idea that they're three separate elements. It's just the size of things. So if we drew bounding boxes around these elements, I think we'd find out pretty quick that all the bounding boxes are roughly the same size again. Right? This feels like three medium shapes. Whereas what you might want is a large shape for our fence. Like that's taking up a lot more of the frame. Then a medium shape for a horse. And then maybe our mountain occupies a really small, thin shape that goes back in the background, right? I think again we've got that balance. I think the other thing that this helps with is it kind of reinforces the perspective again. So biggest shape is closest to us in the foreground because we're closest to it, and then they decrease in size as they get further away, a bit like that grass, right? But it's that big, medium, small is, I think a lot of the time people think of big, medium, small in terms of design. Like, I have a cube, how can I break it into like big, medium, small paneling with detail or whatever else? But I think it works just as well illustratively, right? So that is going to be my advice, and I will put this in the feedback channel. Okay. Right, let's just close the brushes panel so we can have all my layers. Next is this. And the question is, how can I soften edges without it looking muddy or messy? You've used the hard round brush for yonks, and you want your stuff to look a bit more like EVC art. Okay. I think there are loads of different scenarios in which edges should be soft versus could be soft. And I think there's also a comparison to explain that you're already using soft edges, even if you don't maybe realize it, right? So I think there are two kinds of edges. I think number one, or there's two kinds of yeah, we'll say there are two kind of edges. I would say there's something called a technical edge and something called a visual edge, right? So if we compare a technical edge, you could have something like that. Technically, it's a very hard edge. Okay, and then technically, this is a soft edge, as in the alpha is actually soft or hard on the brush, right? But I think you're already using visually soft edges without maybe realizing it. So if I grab a square, let's just switch to HSP sliders. Okay, and then I say, actually, let's use a really hard brush. Then you would say that the edge here is really hard, right? It's both technically hard and visually hard. But if I take the same thing, right, and I just do that, is this still just as hard as this one, right? Is that just as hard? I think it's softer. It's at least visually softer because the contrast is lower, right? So even though technically the quality of the edge in terms of the way that the pixels are working in Photoshop is exactly the same, this is a softer edge than this, right? And we could take that to its logical conclusion with something like that. There is still an 100% hard edge going straight through the center of that technically, but visually that edge is no longer there. Okay, so bearing in mind that you already have a variety of edges, right, visually at least, I think we want to focus our efforts softening edges in cases like these, where actually you already have a visual edge, you already have two values or two colors that are quite close together, and so that edge is visually softened, and we can just technically soften it as well. So I'm going to grab something like a smudge tool, but in fact I won't grab a smudge tool because I know that Photoshop smudge tools are reasonably specific to Photoshop. I'll show you how to just do it with a brush. So I'll grab a brush that's just something like that, or you could even just use a soft brush. I prefer like a soft brush that has a little bit of noise. So I think I'll use something like this. I'm going to turn the opacity down a ton, and I'm finding out where these edges are. And so, well, there's edges inside of this shape here that I think we can soften. And all I'm doing is I'm softening between the shapes that you already have. Now, that edge for that turn of the cheek, I think is a little bit harder, but it's still reasonably soft. Okay. Right. Whereas that's a super high contrast edge that maybe I don't really want to touch, or if I do touch it, I'm not softening it anywhere near as much as the other edges that I've already affected. And we can think about doing this all over the shop. Right. So these values are all reasonably similar. Maybe they get grouped. You know, there's not an awful lot of contrast there. Okay. Maybe we just lose the jaw completely there. Do we need it? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I think the other benefit of working digitally is that we can just obliterate stuff, and then if we decide, actually I want that back, we can just bring it back, and that's fine as well. The material of this seems to be maybe more reflective, and so I think it deserves to have harder edges, but I think you're already, let's grab your original again. I think you're already there. You're already playing around with soft edges. You just don't realize it. It's actually a way that most oil painters sort of paint is by just mixing paint colors that are closer together, right? Until gradually you get a soft edge. You see Alberto Mielgo do this as well, where, you know, if you're saying, well, I want this edge to be soft, all you need to do is introduce an in-between increment, and then you introduce an in-between of that in-between. Like I'm using a hard brush, but it's just more steps, and that turn becomes softer. So again, all those edges are technically perfectly hard, but the values are just closer together. It's more steps. Maybe think of it like a 3D renderer or something. Is there are more steps that are going on? Or you can smudge like that. One last thing. Just as a technicality to bear in mind when you're considering edges, I think a lot of the time we can categorize edges in terms of shadow type as well, right? So if we have some kind of sphere, and we say, look, it's got two shadows. It's got a shadow that's on the sphere, and then it's got a shadow that's on the floor next to the sphere, and actually maybe we bother ourselves to use an ellipse tool for that. Okay. This shadow is on the sphere is what we might refer to as a form shadow. This shadow that's on the floor is what we might refer to as a cast shadow. The form shadow is on a sort of zoomed in level. It's almost like it's turning away from the light source. And in this case, because it's a sphere, it's turning away slowly. Because it's turning away slowly, then it becomes softer. Right? So form shadow, softer. Cast shadow, harder, because actually it's just light that's being blocked from touching that ground plane. Right? So you could bear that in mind. I think in this situation, the lighting is in a way where you don't necessarily have like form versus cast shadows. We could imagine maybe that there is a harsher shadow onto that top lip, but that the underside of it that comes around the nose is much softer. Like it's softer here and it's harder underneath. So there's a difference between core and cast. I swear I was going to mention something else, but my brain has forgotten. What was I going to mention? Yeah, I think the process that you use to paint is a big part of the final result of a painting. So in this case, we are taking something that's hard edged and we are smudging it or blurring it. Let's find another example of that, shall we? It used to be something I did a lot, but I don't do much anymore. So that's an okay example. So it's hard edged shapes, and then we're making a decision about which of those edges we smudge. I think this can look more procedural. I think it can look more like, oh, that's a person who smudged some shadows. It looks smudgy. Whereas the artist that you've brought up as an example, I think probably works in a way that's sort of general to specific, in the sense that they probably start with big, soft relationships between shapes and things, and then they're doing the opposite. They're deciding which of those edges should be hard, and you're deciding which of those edges should be hard based on where you want the viewer to look, based on where you want or where the most contrast is in terms of value. And so that's how this was painted. Let's just make it black and white so we're not worried about color. So the way I painted this, and it's an exercise that I give my students in a class, was I started with a really big soft brush. I don't necessarily think you should do all your paintings this way. I think it's a kind of an annoying way to paint sometimes, but the results can be interesting. But I do think it's an interesting study exercise, which is that you start with a huge brush, like as big as it can be on the page, right? And then once you've said, okay, that's as much information as I can get down with this brush, like I can't really get any more information on, maybe I can get the idea that we're gradating from dark to light, then you move your brush, make it a little bit smaller. And so it's like, well, now my brush is a little bit smaller. When my brush is going smaller, it's not just that the brush size is changing, it's that as the brush size changes, the edge gets harder, right? And so then you make all the decisions you could possibly make with a brush at this scale, yada yada yada, until you get your brush to that scale, right, where we've got soft edges. And it's almost like you're focusing a camera really slowly, and you're finding out what you can and can't see, to the point where you'll get your brush reasonably tiny, and you get the ability to really sharpen edges where you want edges to be sharp, right, etc. etc. But you can leave some edges nice and blurry, and you get like this huge range. It's like you're using the full value scale. You're using the full scale of edges from super soft to super hard. So yeah, that's how this was done. And you can see that like this edge is just, it's a big shape, and so I don't think it needs a particularly sharp edge, whereas maybe some of these smaller bits of information do need sharper edges here and there. But then the relationship of this gradient on the face, that can be a big smooth gradient, doesn't need to be. But I'm also sharpening up those cast shadows like I mentioned. So that might be an interesting exercise, and I can talk more with you about that if I haven't made much sense. But I think in essence what I want you to take away from this, at the risk of me repeating myself, is that you already have a range of edges. You might be sat there thinking, oh, all of my work just has hard edges. The range of edges is there. It's just not expressed using hard or soft brushes. It's expressed through less or more contrast. Right. I hope that helped. Let's put that in the feedback channel and move on to the next person. Let's read the OBS. Big fence, pointillism. Yeah, dots are all hard edged, but they can be visually blue. There is a Discord. There's also a Patreon Discord. There are two separate ones. Yeah. Yeah, the airbrush is awesome. I think the airbrush tool gets a lot of flack. I think it gets a lot of flack for a good reason. I think when beginners use it, the results can look really muddy. But if you know and understand what you're doing with it, you can really play around with that full range of edges in a much more freeing way than maybe if you were just using the hard round. So next we've got Mr. Borger, who's actually got these quite nice paintings. We've got two of them. Let's take these. Let's make them way smaller. What's the question here? You've just started painting and you don't really know what you're doing. Could have fooled me. Can you give me general feedback on it and what you should start focusing on? I think you're doing a nice job. I don't know that there's one specific thing I could recommend. I suppose it would depend on exactly what your goals are. Is there a particular style of illustration that you're aiming for? Are you aiming to be an illustrator? Is there a speed issue that you're having? How long does it take to make these? All of those questions are going to factor in. This is really wonderful. I like these crisp shadows. I like how kind of sketchy and messy things are. I think there are some areas where I see the brush alpha doing the work and not you. So what I mean by that is, if I used the hard round and I was trying to make these shapes and patterns that are on the chest, right, just these flecks, let's just obliterate all of this for now. So if I were to use the hard round to do that, the equivalent would be you're kind of doing that, right? But the problem is that I'm allowing the hard round brush to dictate to me what those shapes should be. You might not see that as a problem. I think it's maybe a good habit to at least be aware of, is that the brush is having an influence on the marks you're making. And so in an ideal situation, we put down the mark and then we cut back into it to ensure that it's exactly the shape that I want here, because those shapes are indicators of perspective. And so we want them to be precise. I think we want to think precisely. And that doesn't mean we want to think complexly. Like we don't need to have this be hyper realistic or anything. They're still very, very simple shapes, but they're carefully placed because they're serving a function. And as they turn around the body of the owl, this sphere, should they become thinner but more densely packed? I think that happens. So as they get around this edge, they're sort of clustering, and then as they face us head on, like over here, there should be fewer of them and they should be more widely spaced. Right. Let's have a look in voice chat. Are you is Burger in the voice chat? No, they're not. Are they in the stream? Oh, yes, they are. Values and relying way too much on tools without knowing what they do. Yeah, so I guess I've answered maybe some of the tool question. Is actually just making a decision about what these shapes are. I think that's where maybe actually using something like the hard round is really, really good. I think most people tend to use it when they're learning because it forces you to make these decisions yourself. Like if I want a really cool expressive shape, I have to physically put it down and carve back into it and do whatever else I want to get that shape rather than maybe relying on a nice texture. The values seem okay to me. Values seem absolutely okay to me. Hold on, the dog is standing on my keyboard. Let's have a think. I mean, there's an awful lot of contrast here, but I would have to look at an owl's feathers to see if that's an appropriate level of contrast. I think someone's knocking on my door. I'll be right back. We're back. We are back. It was my neighbour asking when he should come round tomorrow to look after the dog, which is great. I think everything's getting quite busy here. You already have these very high contrast marks over here, so maybe we just want to group these values together a little bit more. But I don't know. I don't know if this is what the owl looks like. Maybe the whole owl is meant to be really high contrast. It's difficult to know, you know. I think it's also a bit tricky to tell how well you're using your values because it's such a high contrast image. I think maybe if I saw a painting of yours where you were trying to do something a little bit more subtle, like daylight coming through an open window or something, it would be easier to know whether or not this stuff was good. But do you see how just by grouping that big shape together, that noise isn't having quite as much of an effect? Because ideally you want the audience, I guess, to look up here And so the way that I want to think about it is that we want like low contrast down here, and then we want mid contrast there, and then we want high contrast up here. And so it's this like gradation of contrasts. There's nothing wrong with using black and white to express differences in value or differences in contrast. I mean, in this case, it works really well because it's meant to look like a bit of flash photography, right? And so the extreme black contrast works reasonably nicely. We could even get like a, you know, literally pure white contrast in the owl's eyes or something as well. Like, there's absolutely no reason why we can't do that. So, no, I wouldn't worry about that too much. I would begin to think about using value compositionally, right? Where do you want someone to look? I think a lot of the time our focus when we're painting is maybe too much on just can we copy this image well? But we're making images, and so where do you want your audience to look? Do the values represent that? The second one is interesting. I think it doesn't have enough of a value contrast. It feels like nothing is lit. You know, should these arms have some kind of obvious shadow side versus light side? Maybe you don't want that. Maybe it's a very graphic image. But I think that more obvious value contrast would enhance the image, because then we can start thinking about not just the shapes that we're drawing with line, but the shapes that those values are making. And then a lot of this information that I think is maybe getting a little bit busy and cluttered at the moment, we can simplify that into just collections of shapes as well. Yeah, and the shapes can still have stuff in, it's just they'll have less of that stuff. Obviously the biggest thing when you're painting is it's not painting at all, it's drawing. And so these look okay. Something funny is going on down here with his legs and his cape. I don't know why it's making that shape. But I think just the more you learn about painting, I wouldn't treat it as though it's its own thing. It's just think of it as an extension of drawing. So you want to make sure that these things make sense in perspective, that you understand every aspect of them before you move on to something else. So, always drawing. Let me take a screenshot of this and put it in the Discord. There you go. Next we've got this. And it just says, any thoughts? I do have thoughts. I've always got thoughts. This is a tricky one. Let's just group everything else it seems to me that one of these figures is basically not being lit by the fire at all, which is tricky because you're going for a very specific stylistic interpretation of two people in front of a big fire, and I see this, and all I'm thinking is, how would this work, or how would this function? I'm thinking very functionally. I'm thinking the fire is probably warming up the entire atmosphere of the image, so everything is getting warmer. Then the fire is almost definitely lighting up other parts of these figures. Let's find a more appropriate color, maybe. Right. We're going to see lights there. Depending on how strong the fire is, like, is this material for this dress translucent? Are we going to see heat and light come through that? Maybe. I think this light on this hand is too bright, though. You can't have a light from a fire that's brighter than the fire itself. The fire can only ever output something. It can only ever reflect a light that is as bright as itself at most. So let's just take that down a notch. Like, a lot of this stuff's metal, so I think the trick with metal is just as it's reflecting the fire, it also has to reflect the shadow of the background, right? It's reflecting everything around it. So just like it's reflecting the fire, if you want this to read as being more metallic, I think you want it to begin to reflect everything else, and maybe get considerably higher contrast because of it. Let's have a look in VC. One of the figures is imaginary. Oh, having that really glowy hand. Is that what you're talking about? It's intended to be that bright because this figure is some kind of spirit. I think storytelling wise that's not reading. I think because of the angle of the light, it kind of feels as though, I guess it's maybe just where skin is showing, but it's getting close to the fire, and so it does feel like it's lit by the fire. You could brighten up other parts of the character in a similar way to imply that actually it's their skin, or just their being that is glowing. You could have that glow be a deliberately different color, right? That glow could cast its own light onto other surfaces. If it's not coming from the fire, then it can do all sorts of wacky stuff. But I think it's not reading particularly well at the moment. I think maybe I think a lot of problems can be solved again with drawing more than with painting. So let's think about the drawing of it. Like at the moment, what you have is you've got two figures that stood right next to each other, and then you've got a big fire we don't know what's caused the fire. We don't know why it's there. Have they started it? Are they just getting rid of it? I'm not sure. You want this figure to feel like a spirit that's like watching out for the other person because it's imaginary, maybe. So I mean, you could have it two ways. You could have here's figure one, and actually the shot that we've got now is that they're looking down into the fire and we're looking over their shoulder, right? So if you want it to feel forlorn, I think what you're asking for is for us to emote or relate to the character's expression, right? And I think by having us sort of over their shoulder, we're seeing what they're seeing, right? And then you can play around with all this fire that's like close up and going round. And maybe this character that's their arm. That character's just out of frame, trying to like pull them back or comforting them or something, right? So I don't think you should necessarily feel the pressure to have the entire character's body on screen. I don't think that's super important. Okay, but we could also do the opposite, and it's interesting. Like this process that I'm going through is just a thumbnailing process. It's reasonably standard. Is I'm just iterating on my idea and seeing which one is going to work best. Did you do something like this, or did you just sort of go straight into the? Oh, I'm just going to paint this illustration. See if it works. Like we could just as easily have. I don't know what their hair looks like from the front, right? But they've got their sword, their hand by their side or whatever. That's their sash. So we'll put the perspective the other way because we're sort of looking up at them. And then maybe this figure's like further away in the background with their hand on this shoulder. Right, and we know that there's a fire because it's going to be reflected into the character. Maybe you can like see it in their eyes, but actually from this angle, if again the point of the image is that we relate to them in some way and we understand that they feel forlorn, you can show that on their face, right? We can see that they look forlorn. We don't need to guess. There's also potential to say, well, what have they set fire to? Are there like buildings in the background? Or, I don't know, maybe they're in a forest, there are trees in the background, right? But they're all sort of pointing up in that 3-point perspective. So you've got a couple of other sketches. Your sketches are telling me that you have some drawing to work on, I think. So your sketches are all like very side-on, very graphic, very flat, which is fine if that's what you want from the image, but you have to be aware of is that actually a limitation in your drawing ability to draw these characters from maybe some more interesting angles. It very much is a limitation. Yeah, so you need to you can see that it's quite freeing once you figure out that you can rotate that camera and you can almost imagine yourself as a camera person on a film set saying, where am I going to take it from? I would think of it I'd think of it like that. If I got you and your friends and I gave you a camera and I said, go and pose your friends and take a photo as though one of them's forlorn in front of a fire and the other one's comforting them, I bet you would almost immediately start sort of crouching and like tilting the camera in an interesting way, or get like standing on a chair and trying to get a shot over the shoulders or something like that, because you wouldn't have that drawing limitation in your way. So that would be a more true expression of your artistic vision, if you want to think about it that way. As soon as you take away that drawing limitation, it would be interesting to see what kind of angles you chose. Yeah, I think that piece does have a much more interesting perspective that you've just posted, and I would go for things that have a more challenging perspective, if for anything, just to challenge yourself and maybe force you to level up those drawing skills. Yeah. Do you have any other questions? I think that the main thing probably is going to be this drawing. There's some material stuff with the painting, but I wouldn't necessarily worry about that. I would put all of my time, I think, into just drawing, life drawing, figure drawing, gesture drawing, as much as you can. I think we jump the gun a lot of the time. I certainly did it when I was younger. I went, forget this drawing stuff. I want to do painting because that's what all the pros do. But the drawing is just infinitely more important. Okay. Let's read Streamlabs. Pog advice. Great way to get free references too. Yeah, do ask your friends to pose for free references. Or take photos of yourself. I think that's a wonderful way. Next we got Yog. Good old Yog. Is Yog here? Maybe. Maybe not. Yog's wonderful. I do have some feedback though. Yog? No Yog? That's okay. Okay. If Yog were here, I would say that the distribution of light shapes is not as focused as it could be, and that there is some kind of wacky perspective stuff going on. I know it's intentionally wacky, but I think it could be wacky within a bounds, right? And so let's think about the perspective. We've got like this curvilinear thing happening, right? Got all this crazy stuff, but your horizon is still here, right? And so in theory, the way that this should work is that once things go above the horizon, they should start curving the opposite way, right? So everything below the horizon is curving up, and then everything above the horizon should start curving the other way back and down. So let's just play with that idea for a second. Is this... I mean, it's really kind of difficult to see, isn't it? But that it's curving back up, I think it leads you back into the image. But maybe this line should be less curved because it's so close to the horizon. And maybe this should be more curved because it's further away. Does that make a difference? Does that curve on the roof? Obviously you'd also want to curve all the windows. I think it's like as soon as you get close to the horizon, the wacky, crazy perspective begins to sort of unfold like a very complicated knitted jumper. You can't see the stream. Oh, why is it? There you go. So I've just tilted the roof up, but I think I would also want to grab these windows and tilt them into place as we get closer to that horizon. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. yeah, the other thing is definitely the distribution of lights. We're going mad. We've got so many. Should we just see if we can destroy them all? Let's. Yeah. Right. Right. We've got no lights anymore. Someone's turned them all off. Okay. And then we can put a mask on this and we can say, where do we really want those lights? Or maybe we just want them clustered around this street down here at ground level. Like we've got a path that's going through the image. Right? Now we could have a few lights certainly in the city in the background, because that's where they're going, that's their final destination. Maybe we have a few lights peeking up here and there out of some of these windows. But I think I would be tempted not to put in so many. I think this is a less is more kind of a situation. Where actually we can guide our eye a little bit better. Maybe we introduce a couple more down here. The way that I'm thinking about it is kind of like a gradient from dark to light, where the bottom of the canvas is most lit. Like this is basically all of your original lights down here. But as we get further up, I think I'll bring the lights back around there. I think that's a good idea. It separates the buildings and sort of leads us back in that direction. But a whole host of those lights on the rooftops maybe don't need to be so bright. Maybe we can just change the color on this. Make it a bit brighter and bluer. Because otherwise it's a lot. It's a lot visually. I will leave that there for Yog. It's a wonderful image. I'm sure that is plenty for you to think about, work on. Right. Next we've got exotic Satsujin. I'm just going to screenshot the person on the right because the person on the left is nude. The question I think is, how would I shade the guy on the right's drapery? It depends what kind of drapery it is. I would probably just do that magic wand tool so that I've got it sampled. I would pick a darker, warmer color. Again, it depends on what the lighting scenario is. You know, it might be a darker, cooler color if that's what the ambient light of the scene is. And then it also depends on what angle this is being lit from. Like I could shade it on the assumption that it's being lit from that left side, right? In which case we might get like a triangle under there. You know, the head might actually cast a shadow or something else. But there are so many parameters that I don't know how well I can answer this just outright. So I would think about exactly what's going on. I tend to think about painting as a 3D program, really. Like I'm going, where's the light coming from? What's the light's intensity? How big is the light? Because that'll affect how sharp the shadows are. What's the color of the light? What's the color of the other lights that are in the scene? How are they gonna affect? Or there are so many parameters that go into this that simply ask, how would I shade it? Is I don't think I can answer that, but I'll still post this in the Discord. we'll take a Streamlabs. So yeah, people are seeing they can't see anything on the screen, which is great. Hopefully that's fixed. Someone has said, how do I deal with burnout? You haven't drawn this little in years. You haven't had the energy to get anything done for the past few weeks. Yeah, I just force myself to do something. I set timers, and I say, no, I'm gonna paint something. I'm gonna do something. I don't. I guess I do get. I get burnout, but it can't. It doesn't prevent me from drawing because I have to for my job. I suppose that sometimes I don't feel like drawing in my own time, but you don't have to draw in your own time necessarily, right? I think you could treat drawing, if it's just you're doing it for a hobby and you just enjoy it, then just take a break. Don't have to draw. If you're doing it because you either have a job drawing or you're aiming to have a job making art, then I would set yourself timers and treat it like a 9 till 5. Now you can take breaks, but those breaks don't have to be. You don't have to stop drawing altogether. A break could be a change in subject matter. Have you ever done creature design before? Maybe you've only ever done sci-fi drawings. So if you swapped and you started doing creature design, well, that might be something quite fresh for you, quite new for you, it's quite exciting. Maybe you have done loads and loads of 2D drawing. Why don't you hop in Blender and sort of draw in 3D? And when I say draw, I mean like arranging objects and things. I would say sculpting is just as valuable as drawing, and so you could take a break and you could play around with that. But it's a tough one because your response to burnout depends on so many other options and things, right? Mikolaj is right. I think experimenting I really enjoy. When I feel burned out, I don't know, I start painting in VR or with my feet, or I'll do some oil painting because I think that's more of a challenge. I'm not used to, something that I can play around with and be a little bit more free with. I have been playing around in Blender recently because I didn't fancy doing much painting. So just changing it up. Change is scary, but it's I think it's good for you, and then you come back to drawing more powerful than ever before, right? So yeah, Caramel Dancing, really, really great. Really great advice there. 7-hour stream of Caramel Dancing. That'll do. That'll sort your burnout. Right, next is Jam. Brackets pumped up. Right. And the question is, this is your little brother sleeping. You don't know how he managed to do that, but you got his duvet wrapped around to look like a dress or something. The bed is old. We moved not that long ago. I was captivated by the shape of the duvet and the light fall off on it. I wanted to make it simplified, but with realistic lighting. I wanted to play with the texture too, so crit on that would be helpful. Okay. I think you've done a pretty good job. Maybe we can play around. I've just got some ideas. So maybe we can play around with softness. Obviously we've already introduced this idea of visual softness, like we could darken these shapes here just so it's lower contrast as it turns away. I find the fall off of like patterns on objects to be reasonably quick, but maybe we can play with actual softness as well. So let's grab a brush and let's say that this spot down here is the hardest spot in the whole wide image. There's nothing crisper. In fact, we're going to go lighter as well. Right, and then as we begin to get further away, we're just going to introduce some softer shapes. because I think this is what would happen if you were stood there, that these shapes would begin to actually just act as a kind of visual noise as they recede into darkness. Right, and then maybe we get even softer to the point where like some of these shapes are beginning to combine with one another. Like, is this interesting? I think this is interesting. We could do a similar thing up here. You know, maybe I've softened them a little bit too much, but I like that. It's almost like a camera focus. So that's interesting. What else? Yeah, I think the lighting's nice. I think you got some nice realistic lighting. I think maybe the skin on your brother looks a little bit matte. If they're anything like me, they get reasonably sort of hot and bothered when they're asleep, especially under a giant mega blanket. So like the introduction of some slightly lighter specular highlights, like corner of the mouth, under the nose. I like how you're simplifying the eyes into just these bigger shapes, but maybe they could do with a reintroduction. Like, as these shapes are turning around the form, what if we turn towards light? Just a wacky sort of rotation. I don't know. I think another thing that you tend to get with drapery like this is these like Y shapes. So you'll have a fold, and then you'll have another fold come out of it. And so let's make this on another layer. Here's our initial fold that could maybe be a little bit crisp or crisper. There's a fold that's coming out of it, but where they meet, like the depth of the Y, I almost think that stuff gets like brighter. No, I think you've done a wonderful job. Yeah, I have some vague ideas about maybe how I would tackle some of this stuff. I'm always relatively keen on again, I think it comes down to this. If you've been here for the whole stream, it comes down to this difference between technically hard edges and visually hard edges. And I think this is the opposite. So before, with Klomowski, you had this idea that actually the edges were all technically hard, but visually soft. And so they didn't need to be softened because the values were close enough together that they were already softened. Whereas here, I think technically the edges should be hard. Like there's no reason for these circles to be softer in terms of the, you know, if I took a photo with a camera, they would be hard edges. But I'm making them soft because they would feel softer as the contrast reduces, and so I'm just reinforcing that by actually making them technically soft, if that makes sense. So I think that's kind of a wacky one to think about, but hopefully that makes sense. You've got some really dark shadows in some areas and not others, but I don't mind that too much. I like how this is handled, so I'll put this in the feedback channel. I hope that was helpful. And I think, oh, we got one more. Let's put this in. Do we have space? We'll put it there. I'm guessing this is just a study. I don't know if you're in VC or the stream. I think it works reasonably nicely as a study. I think I have a preference for the kind of background that we're seeing here, and my preference is that I prefer to visually simplify something rather than this gives it a kind of lens blur effect, which is fine if that's what you want to go for. I think I would be more tempted to just say, how can I simplify this? Like, those shapes are simple, but they don't feel like you've just applied a blur filter to them, if that makes sense. Like, they still feel just as painted as everything else. Sometimes the blur is just a little bit, it stands out a bit. You know, the point of blurring something is that maybe it falls into the background, but I think sometimes a really strong Gaussian blur like that actually makes the background stand out more, separates it, because you don't really have a soft Gaussian blur like that on any other part of the image, and so maybe I would just put some slightly sharp edges back. It's still softer than everything else, maybe, but I have. But yeah, I think that's a personal preference more than anything else. It's not something that I would enforce or think is a better way of working. I think the biggest area that's maybe a little bit confused at the moment is this crystal thing. I think a lot of these complex shapes are they're not precise enough compared with other parts of the image. So if the whole image was this sketchy, I think you get away with it, but I assume you've used like a chain brush here, and because you've got something that is as mechanical and as precise as this chain brush, well, all of a sudden I don't think you get away with having this be quite as unclear or not obvious as to what it is, especially because compared with the choker or I think that's like a wallet or something, or a canteen, or maybe it's just another part of a belt. Compared with the other stuff, I think that's the most interesting object there, but it's the least rendered. Does that make sense? I think if anyone saw this table of objects, they would be looking at that, because it's like, ooh, this is a shiny, it's complex, it's got a lot of detail and information, but we can't see it because it's the least rendered. So I'd render that up a little bit more, so that it's at least as rendered as your chain, this choker, stuff like that. Okay. There is a VOD Yog. I think YouTube streams automatically get VODed, so you should be okay. Does anyone have any questions or anything else they want feedback on? Let's put this in the feedback channel. No, we're silent. We can put Spotify back on. Oh, what's the best way to practice or study drawing? I think you want to break drawing down into 2 categories. Should we just expand our canvas? Let's chunk. I should just make a YouTube video about it, really. But I'm not. I don't make YouTube videos. Right. So I think we can break drawing down into 2 categories, which is optical and conceptual. This is something Harold Speed talks about in a book. You can think about optical as 2D and conceptual as 3D, and don't consider these separate sections that are sort of walled off from each other and you pick one. Consider them working with each other to make something quite magical. When we say 2D, I mean, let's take this eyeball, for example. So the 2D shape that's happening here, is something like this, right? And it's very much just the 2D shape. If you asked me to draw this from another angle, I might struggle, right? Whereas the 3D understanding of that is, okay, well, there's some kind of a sphere, right? And then that sphere has to have eyelids that wrap around it in perspective. And as they wrap around it, they fold in perspective or whatever else. And then you've got a brow bone that comes down. And because I'm sort of figuring out each individual component more like I'm maybe sculpting, I think I could rotate this from another angle, right? But I think you want both. So you want to understand and recognize these 2D shapes. And for that, I think you just get a load of images and you just draw them. That's all you do. You get a load of images of anything you like, rocks, trees, animals, people, and you just draw and draw and draw and draw and draw, and your hand gets used to copying 2D shapes, and it gets used to understanding what shapes are intuitive and appealing and what shapes aren't. The 3D stuff really requires you to learn perspective, for which you should just read How to Draw by Scott Robertson. And just follow along with the exercises. It also relies on, I think, life drawing is like one of the best things you can do, because when you're life drawing, you are seeing things in 3D space. You're not seeing them as 2D shapes. You're seeing them as a collection of 3D forms, and you're understanding how 3D they feel, right? So, bit life drawing, that'll help you. If you're looking for perspective in terms of specifically figure drawing, I really quite like Morpho and Tom Fox. They're pretty cool, right? But it's this combination that brings things to life. When you're drawing and you understand the 3D form of something at the same time as you Like, I'm drawing 2D shapes, but I'm drawing 2D shapes that are simplified versions of the 3D forms that I understand to be here. So hopefully that makes sense. You have the opposite question: how do I express something without using lines or drawing? Well, you express it with shape, and shape is it's kind of what we do with this. Like, most painting is shape, right? You can express anything with shape as long as you have two values, because as soon as you have two values, you're effectively expressing something as being the difference between something. It's contrast, right? It's not the values that are expressing the form, it's the difference between values. It's the contrast that tells you where things move into light or move away from light. So I guess all or most painting is expressing form without line. Yeah, Schmid's really good. Alla Prima by Richard Schmid. You can get a PDF. I do have an actual copy, but it took me like forever to find on eBay for a reasonable price because it's so expensive. Do I use perspective grids a lot? No, I don't use perspective grids at all. That's not to say that they're not really useful. I just think you learn them until you don't need them anymore, right? So you learn how to express something using a grid until you get to the point where your perspective is sort of ingrained information, like whatever weird structure this is, and then it becomes more intuitive. If I really, really, really want to have a solid 3D base for something, and I'm still not sure on my perspective, at that point I will open up Blender and I will build it in 3D. So I still think you should learn to do it by hand, because it makes you a better intuitive drawer, even if you never draw another perspective grid for as long as you live. I think you should learn how to do it. It's more about observation than anything else, but I think, no, if I actually want to block something out, I'll block it out in a 3D program, yeah. General question: have I tried any new mediums or programs lately? Not brand new, but I've been using Blender more. So, I wonder if I can screen share Blender without everything crashing. Hold on. Let's see. Blender. Bear with me. Blender. Yippee! So I've been playing around in Blender a whole lot more and making cool scenes with particle distributed foliage and playing around with lighting and mood and whatever else. And then arranging a shot and then going back to Photoshop like this, right? And the goal when I'm going back to Photoshop is sort of seeing how well I can. So this is the render. seeing how well I can enhance the render. I don't want to spend all of my time in Blender. I don't particularly enjoy floating around 3D programs. Maybe I'll enjoy it a bit more in future, but I take this and then I'm like, how can I hide the fact that it was done in 3D and paint over it to add a bit more storytelling. So now this guy's got a gun and he's sort of stretching out his hand as though to say, you know, you tried to run away, but maybe, you know, come with me. And then she's got a gun behind her back. She's ready to get him. So just a little like micro story, but yeah, uses the 3D mainly to get characteristic shapes that are in perspective that I can then paint inside of. But what about your pig painting from a week ago? Is this on the Discord? Oh, yeah, people in the Discord, you won't be able to see Blender. I switched the stream on I switched the stream on Streamlabs. There's a pig on Discord. How far back do I have to scroll? From Jam. Let's see. Pig. I saw your Richard Schmid. That was nice. I saw your Lion Decker. I see no pig. Oh, I see those pigs. That was very experimental. I will say I didn't recognize them as being pigs when I saw them. I was just focused on the figures. Yeah, I like the stripies. And they're all placed by hand. People keep asking if they can have my rake brush, and it's not a rake brush, it's just a pencil brush that I hatch with. Maybe I should be smart and make a rake brush so that I don't damage my wrists. That could be a plan. Yeah, I like the pigs. I think they're cool. It feels very sort of Devin Corwin-esque with these really quite specific shadow and light shapes, and then noise and hue jitter inside of those shapes. I think that's cool. Oh, someone has... you've linked me back to the pig. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's been a nice stream then, gang. I hope to get back into streaming more often. It's a little bit tricky because I do evening life drawing and I have a loving fiance, so my evenings are monopolized. But I would like to do it a bit more. I've got a video on the go at the moment that is in the middle of being edited and recorded. I want to get back into making those, but I want to make them much longer, and I want to spend like a couple of weeks just polishing up the editing and actually making it a bit more than just a time lapse with me sort of grumbling over the top of it in a sort of miserable way. So we'll see how that goes. But other than that, enjoy. Those of you who are in the Discord, if you stay around for an extra 5 minutes, we'll play GeoGuessr. So hop in the Discord if you want to play GeoGuessr. Right, enjoy everybody on YouTube. Bye.